This is a thought that never really occurred to me until I got done watching this video on YouTube about how human beings are basically farmed for taxes to maintain the government. Interesting video. And while I think it sort of kind of got to the nature of government in general, kind of missed a few points in what, but 90% right is still the majority rules, right? Because the government can't exist without our taxes. And that got me thinking of another little metaphor I've heard a lot around self defense forums on the internet, and that's the whole sheep, dog, and wolf metaphor by Colonel Grossman. Well, think about this for a moment. You can't defend yourself, or you must depend upon the sheepdog to protect you because you're the sheep. Here's the problem with that. What if I don't want to be a sheep? What if I want to protect myself? What if I want to be responsible for myself? Well, then I'm a wolf. You see, I don't listen to the sheepdog, and I don't mindlessly think of the sheepdog as my guiding hero. So another metaphor for the sheepdog, and wolf is the uh, slave, the slave's enforcer, or actually the slave master's enforcer, or the slave masters. I prefer to use the term slave master's enforcer for a reason. I'll get into this later. And the free man. Now, the free man will always be the wolf, the bad guy, because he thinks for himself, and he doesn't care what the shepherd says. He doesn't depend upon the shepherd to protect him. He doesn't depend upon the shepherd to give him health care. He doesn't depend upon the shepherd to do anything for him. He understands just as well that the shepherd eats lamb or mutton, same thing, still made from lamb. When he's hungry, he feeds the sheepdog from his table, and the shepherd stays warm and makes income off of fleecing the sheep, much like the government fleeces us with taxes to protect those too big to fail. Now, you have to understand the reason why these corporations and such are too big to fail is because they have a lot of contracts with the government. They've spent a lot of time uh, befriending the shepherd, as it were. And so they're too big to fail because now they've gotten fat and plump and lazy, and the government needs them to keep producing wool to keep putting coin in the shepherd's pocket every time he gives the market. To butcher a metaphor and keep carrying it out. But that's basically how it works in the real world, metaphorically speaking. So the problem you have is that the wolf doesn't depend upon the sheep to give him wool to keep him warm. He has his own fur. He doesn't depend upon the sheepdog to protect him. He has his own fangs, and he's willing to use them. This is why the government is so in fear of guns, and gun control is such an important thing. There used to be a time when kids grew up, their parents took them hunting and fishing. Uh, they still do in most of the U.S. for the most part. But there was a time when parents got out. Even family I had that lived in cities would take their kids out in the woods somewhere, uh, to a relative's house who lived out in the country, and go up in the woods with some pop cans and bottles and such, and practice shooting. Why? Because practicing shooting, hunting, all of that taught your kids not only how to fend for themselves and to pluck animals out of the wild, but you also learned about how overpopulation of the animals affected nature and made it harder on the other animals in the biosphere. You also learned that sometimes taking a few uh, was better than was better for the herd. Uh, you learned a lot about nature, tracking animals, how to fend for yourself. Most importantly, you learned how to shoot a gun. Now you can use a gun; it's a tool. It's just like a hammer. I can use a hammer to drive a nail and build a house or a beautiful coliseum. Uh, But at the same time, I can take a hammer and threaten someone, bash their head in with it, and take their wallet. It's not in the tool itself. The tool's an inanimate object. It's in how you apply that tool, how you use that tool. And these little tokens that we give each other, referred to as money, uh, are basically tools. Once you understand they're basically tools, you understand that you can do without that tool, or you can find a better tool to suit you. Uh, so what I'm thinking here is that while Grossman's metaphor can be taken as, ooh, the sheepdog, the protector of the sheep, blah, blah, blah. Well, the problem is a wolf raises their kids to be wolves. A wolf doesn't become sheep, it doesn't become docile. You might be able to turn a wolf into a dog in the fact that a wolf will serve the shepherd or the government or whatever higher group of people out there with more military force to enforce the so-called law. Uh, in that regard, but at the same time, before that wolf evolves into a dog, before he can be domesticated, he's still born a wolf. He has his own fur, doesn't depend upon the sheep to feed him, clothe him, or anything else. And what he wants, he essentially takes from the sheep. Well, that being the metaphor, well, these people are criminals. Well, so does the sheepdog, so does the shepherd. Everyone is feeding off of the sheep. And you get the idea that there's another metaphor behind the metaphor of the hero, the victim, and the villain, and that the people who are perpetual victims are essentially perpetual slaves to their victimhood. That the sheep aren't those being protected, they aren't innocent civilians working for the betterment of society in the flock. They are simply the slaves, the people who are kept down, oppressed, and controlled by a system so that the system, namely the government, can profit from their livelihood and their labor. And this is where your taxes and everything else come in at. And it's not such a bad thing to have a government if the government actually does protect you. But when the government turns to oppressing you, there is an issue. When the government allows its members, its sheepdogs, if you were, to essentially become bullies and oppressors of the people, then the those sheepdogs need to be put down because they've basically turned rabid and are no better off than the wolf. Actually, they're worse off than the wolf since it was originally their duty to protect the sheep. Uh, Either way, there's a metaphor here between this whole sheepdog thing, and I'm just playing with metaphors, just playing with random thoughts in my head at the moment. That you can also look at Grossman's metaphor of the sheep, the sheepdog, and the wolf as a metaphor towards basically being enslaved to society. And this isn't something that's as matter of all, my ancestors were slaves, or I'm black, or I'm white, or you're this or you're that, or whatever. It's nothing about race. It's nothing about this country's history of enslavement, because even the the colonial settlers were brought over here as slaves. Many of them were. Many of the Irish settlers in America were brought over here as slaves to the English. Christopher Columbus landed here from Spain searching for slaves to take back to Spain. Uh, so this country has a whole history of enslavement of other people. And the country which formed us, namely Britain, has a similar history. And when we look at that history, we see that there's always this perpetual concept of the commoners, the peasant class, the serfs who work in and put money into the system and barely survive in it, and the ones who work harder and put more into the system get more out of the system to help themselves. At least that's a theory as it's supposed to go. Basically, the idea of a democratic republic is to have a certain amount of laws that guarantee your freedom and allow you to grow. And as you grow, you grow into that system and put into that system. And the system is supposed to work for you to put back to you. But it's not always like that. A lot of times, the people putting into the system are encouraged to simply just survive. They become your sheep, your your enslaved population of perpetual victims who depend upon the shepherd and the sheepdogs, while those who are more individuals who decide not to be part of a system of psychological enslavement, and you see this in a lot in the media and in the ideas put across by the media and such, that this form of psychological enslavement is encouraged, but it's even if it's encouraged, it's still not something that is forced upon you. You have to choose to take the bait, to go into that concept of being, either the society of or the parts of society that would be considered the sheep, the perpetual victims of their own choices, because you have to make a choice into being the victim, into always being the victim. Sometimes you just have to decide to take a stand. Maybe that's kind of the point of the way the system is. You're not going to change certain people from always being the perpetual victims because that's simply their role in life. But neither can you rip the fangs out of the people who have the ability to stand up and will fight to take or to take back what is theirs. Maybe the idea of the sheep, the sheepdog, and the wolf is that the sheep are perpetual slaves protected by the enforcers of the slave master. Uh, the slave master being the shepherd that no one ever sees, but setting back, telling the sheepdog what to do, while the sheepdog's dog is nipping at the heels of the sheep. And of course, anyone with enough willpower, enough self-sufficiency to step away and say, I don't want to be part of this perpetual system of victimization, is always labeled the wolf, the bad guy, because they really don't need a psychological archetype of victimhood, of self-induced psychological slavery to restrict them and hold them back. Just a thought on another way of taking the whole sheep, sheepdog, and wolf metaphor.